Hello, welcome to the Worship Leader Toolbox podcast. So glad that you are here today and want to invite you to jump in here with us as we begin a interview, a conversation, and a little bit of time with Jeremiah Cox from Champaign, Illinois. Glad you're here, Jeremiah.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Before we get too far, I want to invite you to rate this podcast and to share it with other worship leaders and worship folks in your ministry, and to join us on the Facebook page and the blog website, worshipleadertoolbox.com. And so every once in a while, we just want to spend some time talking with worship leaders and think about what we might learn from that to help in our own ministries and life. So Jeremiah, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Well, I am worship leader at Quest Church in Urbana, Illinois, and my wife and I moved to Champaign to start a new church back in 2004. So we, as our story goes, I like to say that we were going to move to St. Louis. We had a whole plan for our life. We even picked out an apartment. I was going to get Cardinal season tickets. We're going to do the whole thing, right? We were going to move to St. Louis, move to the big city. And I was doing some worship leading at the time throughout college at different retreats and stuff like that. And one of the guys who was leading one of the retreats that I was leading the music for was starting a new church in Champaign. And his name is Andy, who you may know Tim is your current boss. And Andy knew me from that and just sat me down one day and said, "Hey, love to talk to you about being my worship leader at this new church I'm starting in Champaign." And so my wife and I, or my fiance at the time, now wife, we are never one just to say no. We'll just always hear somebody out, if somebody comes to you and wants to ask something. And so of course we took the meeting. I took the meeting, and he kind of laid out his vision for what the church would be. And so that sounds interesting, but probably not. Again, we kind of have things planned about where we're going to go after we graduate. But we did think that if we went and visited the church that this new church would be starting from, it was going to be it's a new church start, but it was going to be birthed is the actual technical term for church planning. And so we thought, if we go check out the church that this new church is going to be birthed from, it'll have different, stylistically it would be different most likely than the new church, but the DNA would be the same as far as the people and the atmosphere. So we went and visited that church on a Sunday morning. It's a New Horizon church out of Champaign. And we just fell in love with the people there. The preaching was amazing. And we got back into our car, and we didn't drive but 2 blocks back to on our way back to Eastern when we said that this is where God's calling us to be. So wow. We scrapped all those plans, and we moved to Champaign. Thought we'd be only there for maybe 5 or 6 years before we moved and settled somewhere else, maybe closer to parents. But just really, this has become home to us. And now I've been in that same church now for going on 16 years.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. And now you got to drive 3 hours to Cardinals games.
That's right. No Cardinals games this year though.
So yeah, that's true.
Sad.
Makes it easier though.
Yeah, it's true.
Saves you time. All right, so that's an awesome story. So tell us about the church as it is now. A little bit about.
Yeah, so for a long time we were nomadic, so we didn't have our own building, and we were like that for I'm been terrible with years and that kind of stuff. But I think if I remember right, we were nomadic for at least 8 or 9 years. And so every Sunday morning we would move our stuff into either hotel conference centers or gymnasiums, and we would set everything up every Sunday morning, and we have to tear it down every Sunday morning. The chairs, the stage, everything, sound system, screen. And so we did that for a long time. And then a few years ago, there was a church in Urbana, Grace United Methodist Church, and they were a much older congregation than we were. They were have been on a pretty steady decline for a few years, and they kind of saw us, and what they saw that we had youth and we had young people and kids, and have been growing. but don't have a building. But they had what we didn't have, which was a building and kind of land. And so they invited us to kind of basically move in with them. I like to say we lived in sin for a couple of years, where we both shared the same building. We even moved our offices into there. And then after doing that for about 2 years, we officially merged with that church. And technically we formed a new church. And so we became Quest Church, a Community of Grace is our technical name. And so we now have, so our two styles, we still have the two different kinds of worship services. So Quest has always been, a modern worship style, and Grace was a traditional Methodist style. So we still, so now even when we merge, we still have a traditional service in the morning, or the first thing in the morning, and then our modern service, which has always been kind of like what Quest has always been right after that. So it's been not without hiccups for sure, but I think it's been a good thing.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So what's a bright spot in the ministry right now?
I think, well, right now is obviously a crazy time.
Yeah, actually, before we say that, we should tell us quick the kind of flow and schedule. I know you mentioned the worship times, but kind of the work week flow for you before and now with all the pandemic stuff. Then you can get to the bright spot. It'll be easier to explain.
Sure. Yeah, totally. So for me, I mean, our staff is fairly small. It's just me. I'm full time. Andy, was the pastor for a long time. Casey is our pastor now. We have an administrative assistant, and then we also have a full time children and youth minister, Angel. And so our work week is basically I pick out the songs sometime early on in the week. I get those out to my volunteer band members. And we stopped having weekly rehearsals a long time ago. I think being the size we are, we're not a huge church, but then also just being in Champaign, it seems like a lot of people maybe are taking classes at night or even teaching classes at night at the university. And so just coming up with a weekly rehearsal time was just a huge headache. We were always having to switch the times. And so basically, I just adopted the strategy of just encouraging and trusting that my team is going to rehearse on their own time. And so they just come on Sunday mornings now, and we get there super early. They get there about 7:00 sharp, and we run through the songs maybe twice, but usually about one. We can go through each song once, and we do a rehearsal from 7 to about 8, and then we have to clear the platform, and then the traditional service comes in, and that happens from 9 to 10, and then our band is back up there at 10 to plug back in, and then we have our modern service at 10:30. So I do help out at the traditional service at times. Sometimes I'll lead some songs with guitar, or I might do like some liturgy for that service. But most of my time and energy is put into doing the music and graphics and video for both services. But modern usually takes a little bit more of my time. So
do you usually incorporate some of the video type stuff that you do, or little tidbits? Are they in both services?
Yeah, they usually are in both services. So it's the same message in both services. And then if I make a video, but honestly, it's been interesting. I at times even have to make 2 different versions of the video because our first service is a much older crowd. And so like even things like background music can be distracting. And so a lot of times I'll even make 2 versions of videos, one with background music and then one with very minimal or even no background music.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it's trying to think about who's watching it. And then also adding subtitles. I started adding subtitles on almost every single video I do now, because at first it was to help our older congregation who it's harder for them to hear. But then also now on social media, it's good to have subtitles on all your videos anyway, because people watch a lot of times, either during meetings when they don't want to turn their volume up or wherever, it's
Sitting in a
still good to
waiting
have them
room
on.
somewhere.
Yep.
Yeah. Is it
So
hard to put subtitles on, or does it does it generate
it's
automatically somehow?
man, video editing is probably the main thing I do in my life for a living, and subtitles are probably the most annoying part of that. There's just nobody has created a good way, or if anybody's listening to this, my gosh, please contact me, let me know. But there is just not an easy way of making subtitles yet. With all the technology we have, nobody's cracked that.
Huh.
So
Strange. So that's good. That's a lot of interesting. Every single church is so unique. It's just unbelievable just to think about how things work, and even the church you're describing, being a United Methodist church, is unusual on several fronts. Just
yeah,
being planted and then merging with the church. Those are like two pretty things that oftentimes aren't successful. So
yeah, yeah,
really
and honestly, I forget what the stats were. Of course, when we started the church, I could have told them to you 10 years ago, but I've basically, it's something, like 50% of new churches don't make it past year 1, 75% of those don't make it past year 3, and then like 90% of those don't make it past year 5, something crazy like that.
Yeah.
But I think one of the best things we did was that we didn't jump into a building too soon. That's like the thing that sinks new churches the
Yeah.
most. And so, whereas that was for me frustrating because I couldn't stand the setting up and tearing down every week. It was just so just annoying and took so much time. But that is honestly one of the things that probably saved us early on. So
Yeah, just no overhead.
Yep.
Or low overhead.
Right.
We kind of did the same thing, except the gross part was we had a building, but we moved one of the services to the gym. So we set up stage every single Sunday for 7 years. And then we finally
in your own building.
Yeah. And then we finally got to marry Rachel. Then we had to work another 7 years to we from 04 until 11, we set up a stage every Saturday night or Sunday morning after all the sports were done, rolled out the soundboard, put all the instruments out.
Wow.
And anything we bought in that time was basically renting, because if you're just inviting a volunteer group or some custodial staff or whoever it was at the time to roll out a drum set, the toms always stayed on there, and it was always on a dolly, just like getting shoved in the closet and then back up on the stage. And it's surprising it even survived.
Well,
so what is your did in all that, you said a lot of great stuff, but did you say a little bright spot? You were going to start one earlier, and then we went to the flow of your week, and
well,
a bright spot in the ministry right now, even in the midst of all the pandemic stuff.
I think it's been cool.
Besides captioning your videos.
Yeah. I think it's been really cool with kind of going everything online. What's been neat about it is seeing the people who have reconnected with the church that we basically kind of fell off our radar, kind of fell off the map, either in the past year or a couple of years. They've kind of re-engaged, which has been really interesting. And apparently even some people have even started giving to the church who just stopped giving a few years ago. Not that that's what it's about, but when somebody gives, that's a sign that they are literally investing.
Yeah.
And so that's been really cool. And I say overall, like our giving has remained fairly stable, which has been great. And again, another sign that people are still engaged. And so it's going to be really interesting. Obviously, I think everybody's asking the same stuff about what's going to happen to church attendance when we get back. But in the meantime, it's been encouraging just to see people stay connected. Our home groups, our small groups, attendance has remained pretty high, all over Zoom for the most part. But I think it's really taught people throughout all of this, that just kind of reminding people of the importance of, oh yeah, this is why church is important. This is why a body of believers is important. I actually do need this.
Yeah.
And so that's been really cool.
That is good. So we don't have much time left, but you've been at a church now, if you said '04 or whenever that was, until 2020. So that's like 16 years roughly.
Yep.
Some of that part-time, some of it full-time, various capacities. So are there any insights you have into, a lot of staff people don't stay at churches, worship
Hmm.
leaders, youth pastors, and various others. Maybe worship leaders stay longer than youth pastors in terms of like stereotypical kind of,
Yeah.
transitioning. But what are some insights you have of being at a church for 16 years in a staff role like that?
Well, so it is really interesting because we started, I was instrumental in starting the church, right? And so um I've never been a kind of, church employee that applies to different churches. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I've never been that guy, right? I've never submitted an
Yeah.
application for a church, gone for an interview, and done that. And so to me, this church is our family, and this is why we moved here. These are my best friends. These are, if something terrible happens to my family, these are the people I'm calling in the middle of the night before I even call my own parents, right? Like these are the people I will live and die for.
Hmm.
And so, um, so to me, it's just been part of who we are. And so, which at times can be terrible if something's wrong at your the very few times that I've had issues with my church leadership or whatever, that's also meant that I've had issues with literally my best friend who is leading our lead team, right?
Yeah.
Our admin council or whatever you call it at the time. And so, um, but for the most part, for the overwhelming majority, it's been good. And so I haven't even entertained ever looking for other jobs just because it's so ingrained in our life. This is why we moved here. This is our family, right?
Yeah.
And so any insights would just be, gosh, if you help start a church, you know, and you survive it, I just
Well,
think
but I think that friendship thing, a lot of people feel like they shouldn't really be friends with people at their
right,
church. And that's kind of a little bit of an old school sort of thing that, used to be that you have to stay a little bit apart so there's not, issues and some of the stuff you were describing. But on the other hand, a lot of people run around and say that's ridiculous because how in the world are you going to invest in a place? I mean, those are kind of like you just mentioned, those are your people and that's where you're at. Um,
yeah,
and I like
well,
your phrase that, and again, there's nothing wrong with people moving here. God calls different people different places.
mhm,
And it's interesting, the idea that it's kind of like one of the things that you could glean from what you just said would be that it's not really a job. I mean, you're employed
mhm,
there and you're getting paid, but it's more like you're living out your life there. I mean,
right,
and and it might come to an end some point. I mean, something might change and that's fine, but to be 100% in while it's happening.
right, and
And
then
there are people in scripture that, I mean, some people in scripture were called to go to new places and some people were called to stay right where they were. And so you gotta go. Abraham had to leave and Noah had to stay. So,
right.
it's going to just depend on where God's leading you.
And then and just also just from a this part isn't as much spiritual as it is just practical. But I've also about 12 years ago started my own video production business on the side. And what that has allowed me to do is, if I have had other churches come and, you know, talk to me about going to their church to to be on their staff, if they've come and they said, hey, financially this would be, put you in a better spot for your family, having kind of a side gig has allowed me to not have to worry about, chasing or going after kind of the next pay raise, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so it's just, yeah, I've often said, like, having this side business that I do at nights and on the weekends has allowed me to just stay right where I'm at and not have to I don't even think about those other opportunities.
Yeah, that is so good. We could have a whole nother talk about, it seems like every worship leader type person or any worship art person has more than one job.
Yeah, yeah,
And I was talking to somebody the other day about it, just saying that it's partly the idea that there's an outlet for creativity, and that's one, it could be some of the drive for it. Like, you don't get to do what you normally do, although you seem like you do both in both worlds as far as video goes.
Yeah.
But some of it's income, like you just talked about. I mean, it's a blessing to the church for somebody to be able to, have be able to serve in a role that isn't going to just keep, scrolling up as age scrolls up, and
Right.
unlike some other businesses that might happen like that. So that's really cool. All right, well, a couple more things. Actually, just one more, and that's just if you have any thoughts about communicating with leadership in your church, senior pastor primarily, because when you are, I read a book once called In Search of Timothy, and the idea that Timothy was an assistant to Paul, and just the power of somebody being there to help support somebody else. So now you've had like two pastors in this church, basically. One that helped start it, was there for a decade or so, and then, or longer, and then the new person who is also there. So what are some just tidbits to communicating as a worship leader? How do you keep all that straight?
So for me, I have just always, and it's interesting that my first pastor is now your pastor. And so I just have always been just brutally honest with anything with both pastors that I've worked under. And overwhelmingly, they have been awesome bosses. I mean, I don't think I would have been at Quest as long as I was if Andy wasn't a great boss, right?
Yep.
And now Casey. And so, but whenever I have had, I mean, and honestly, like again with Andy, I could probably go back in my mind and think of like maybe 2 times in the 12 years we worked together that I had to go to him with an issue. And I remember being in one meeting with him. I think it was like a staff meeting, and something was said, and for whatever reason, it just didn't sit well with me. And we stopped the meeting, and I went across across the hall into my office, and he was in his office. I think I sat there for maybe 15 minutes, just kind of stewing on it. And then I just got up and walked right back across the office, or across the hallway, closed the door, and said, "Hey, here, I think this is what was said, and this is why it bothers me." And we hashed it out, and we're all good. Like, it's just, I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's just a healthy way. Instead of going home and being ticked at my boss for the rest of the night, it's just like in any relationship, a marriage or a friendship or whatever. I just think it's the same thing, and just being totally and just sometimes uncomfortably honest with them, and not be afraid if you think that they've done something wrong or said something wrong, or not even wrong, but just something that doesn't sit well with you. Don't be afraid of just having the guts just to tell them. And just every time you do that, assuming that they're good bosses, which, and again, I've had amazing bosses, they will take that, and then when you leave, your trust is built up that much more every time you do it. So,
well, and I mean, the alternative is to have the annoyance and then let it out in other ways besides just talking to them.
Right.
So
yeah,
what you're describing is just general self-aware, good, normal behavior.
Exactly right. Well, and then I also grew up as a preacher's kid, right? And so my dad was always, we were always moving into churches that were very unhealthy, and he was kind of the fixer, I guess, is kind of what he was. His specialty is he would go into dysfunctional churches and kind of get them working in a healthy way, which meant he would go into churches and have a lot of enemies of just people who loved the way that it was working, and he's coming in, and but I will always remember the people in his church who stood up for him, and who would just always were supportive of the lead pastor. And so I always, growing up, I thought to myself, I'm always going to be that guy. I'm always going to go to bat for our lead pastor. And we will hash it out behind closed doors. We'll argue. We'll do whatever we need to do. But when I am out there in the church, he or she is always going to know Jeremiah's got my back. And so I just think that is so important for not just the worship leaders or people on staff, but people on leadership, right? Is just to have a united front. And so
that's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jeremiah, it's been great to talk to you. So Jeremiah and I also have a whole other connection of the harvest world. And it is true, you mentioned that Andy, who was the pastor of Quest when it started, in the Methodist church, at least, in case you're not familiar with the Methodist system, gets appointed to different churches. So he got appointed to Troy, where I'm serving as a worship leader. So we have this triangle connection, and we've also known each other for a long, long time. And just out of sheer excitement from having so much time at home during COVID, we actually have 2 podcasts going. One is for worship leaders, which you're listening to now, and the other is our Harvest Ministry podcast. So I'm gonna try to get Jeremiah on there, and if you're interested, you could just look up Tim Price and Harvest, and we'll just talk a little bit about life, since we didn't get to do that too much on this one. But before we go, Jeremiah, real quick, if you could just share, you mentioned your video company, and you mentioned just the opportunity you've done sometimes talk to people on different things. So tell us real quick how people like can connect with you in video or social media or any of those.
Yeah, so you can just connect with me on Facebook, and on Instagram. This is Jeremiah Cox. And my business for weddings is Park Life Films. And then I also have any kind of creative or video work that aren't weddings. It's just jeremiahcox.com. So you can go to jeremiahcox.com for all of your Jeremiah Cox needs, which are very few. So
you never know. If you really need something, you need it. We always talk. I know photography is different than videography in some sense, but we always think back and talk about how good the photographer at our wedding was, and the pictures turned out good, and all that was good. But the part that was unique was that she really took the bull by the horns and went crazy when like there was some issue with the cake or something. I don't remember.
Oh, yeah.
Boutonnieres weren't straight. And so that falls in the photography world, but she didn't really like sit around and timid. She was like, hey, come here. Just like got it all working. And so we talked about her a long, long time after that whole thing was over.
Yeah. A good photographer or videographer who are like pros. I mean, they're kind of like a second little wedding planner, because we just know how things are going, and it drives us nuts if things are not smooth sailing.
Well, plus you do one so often that you just know. But we will wind down. We appreciate everybody listening to the Worship Leader Toolbox podcast, and thank you for your ministry, Jeremiah, and time today on the podcast. And want to encourage you to keep being faithful in your ministry. And if we can connect and be helpful in any way, please reach out and do that. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Thanks.